A struggling mother and her child stumble upon a decaying cabin deep in the forest, its presence chilling and strange. When the child whispers, "Mum, it looks scary," she realizes too late why locals avoided it. The cabin once belonged to a vampire who still lingers in the shadows. What begins as fear soon unravels into a dangerous yet fateful encounter, where survival, temptation, and destiny intertwine beneath the moonlit night. This is not just another horror story. This is about a woman who thought she had nothing left to lose until she discovered that some ancient beings offer more than death. They offer transformation. But when darkness calls to you in the form of immortal beauty and forbidden desire, would you answer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you: the October rain hammered against the windshield. As Margaret Hayes guided her 15-year-old Honda through the winding mountain roads of rural Oregon, beside her, 8-year-old Emily pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the evergreens blur past in the gathering dusk. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and Margaret's knuckles had gone white from gripping the steering wheel for the past 6 hours. "How much longer, Mom?" Emily asked, her voice small and tired. "Not far now, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen said the house is just past the town center." Margaret tried to sound reassuring, though her own exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. 2 months ago, she'd been a suburban wife with a teaching position and a mortgage. Now she was a divorced woman with maxed-out credit cards, driving toward a rental she'd found on a website for desperate people seeking cheap havens. Hollow's End appeared through the rain like something from another century. The main street stretched maybe 3 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had probably stood since the logging boom. A general store, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a post office that doubled as the town hall. The pharmacy's windows glowed with warm yellow light, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was theirs now. A place to start over. The rental house sat on the eastern edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the forest pressed close. Margaret parked in front of a small craftsman bungalow with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The landlord had called it rustic charm. Margaret called it affordable. "Is this it?" Emily's disappointment was evident. "It's going to be cozy," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "We'll make it nice. You'll see." They made 3 trips through the rain, hauling suitcases and boxes from the car. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust. The living room held a threadbare couch and a coffee table with water rings. The kitchen had appliances from the 80s. But it was clean, and the landlord had left fresh sheets on the beds. Margaret stood in the center of the living room after Emily had gone to explore her new bedroom. Through the back window, she could see where their small yard ended and the forest began. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks formed a dark wall, maybe 50 feet from the house. In the fading light, the tree line looked impenetrable, ancient and somehow watchful. She twisted the thin gold band on her left hand, a nervous habit she hadn't broken despite removing it 3 months ago. The ring lived in her pocket now, a reminder of promises that meant nothing when her husband decided his paralegal was more interesting than his wife of 12 years. The divorce had been quick and brutal. Richard kept the house, the savings, everything. Margaret got Emily and a battered sense of survival. The teaching job had disappeared next. Budget cuts, they said, but Margaret knew it was about seniority. 20 years of service versus 15. She'd lost by 5 years and found herself jobless at 52, with a child to raise and nowhere to go except away. Far away. Somewhere cheap enough that her meager savings might last until she found work. That night, after frozen pizza and unpacking the essentials, Margaret tucked Emily into bed. The room was small but had a window overlooking the backyard and forest beyond. "Mom?" Emily's voice was hesitant. "Do you think we'll be happy here?" Margaret smoothed her daughter's dark hair, so like her own had been before grey started claiming territory. "I think we'll be okay, sweetheart. Sometimes starting over is the bravest thing we can do. I miss Dad." The words cut, not because Margaret missed Richard, but because Emily shouldn't have to. "I know you do, baby. He'll visit. We'll figure it out," but she knew Richard wouldn't visit. He'd already started his new life, complete with the paralegal and her 2 teenage sons. Emily was a complication he'd agreed to support financially, but nothing more. The checks would come, but he wouldn't. Margaret returned to the living room and stood at the back window again. The rain had stopped, and moonlight filtered through breaks in the clouds, silvering the wet grass and illuminating the forest edge. Something about those woods pulled at her, a strange magnetism she couldn't name. She'd never been particularly outdoorsy, had always preferred coffee shops to hiking trails. But standing there in the quiet house with her sleeping daughter down the hall, she felt the forest calling. The next morning brought pale sunlight and the reality of their new life. Margaret walked Emily to the elementary school, a single-story building 3 blocks from their house. The principal, a weathered woman named Mrs. Kowalski, welcomed them with genuine warmth that felt foreign after months of pity from their old neighborhood. "We're a small school," Mrs. Kowalski explained, leading them through hallways decorated with student artwork. "Emily will be in Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade class. 15 students total. We take care of our own here." Emily clung to Margaret's hand, her usual confidence shaken by yet another new beginning. Margaret knelt down, meeting her daughter's eyes. "You're going to do great, and I'll be right here at 3 o'clock. After leaving Emily with Mrs. Patterson, a kind-faced teacher in her 30s, Margaret walked back through town. The morning revealed details the rain had hidden. Window boxes with late-blooming mums, a bookshop with hand-painted signs, the diner called simply May's, with its door propped open and the smell of bacon drifting out. She needed coffee and information, not necessarily in that order. Inside May's, a dozen tables filled the narrow space. Most were occupied by older men in flannel shirts and work boots, their conversation a low rumble, punctuated by laughter. A woman in her 60s worked behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Coffee, hon?" she asked as Margaret slid onto a stool. "Please, black." The woman poured from a pot that looked older than Margaret. "You must be the new arrival." "Jen's Rental on Forest Edge Road. Word travels fast. Small town. I'm May. Owned this place 40 years come November." She set down the cup and leaned against the counter, studying Margaret with sharp blue eyes. "What brings you to Hollow's End?" "Fresh start." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "My daughter and I needed a change." May nodded, asking nothing more. Margaret appreciated that. "You looking for work?" "Eventually. I was a teacher. High school English. Might talk to Kowalski. They're always needing substitutes. The pay's terrible, but it's something." May refilled the cup without asking. "You settling in okay? That house been empty 6 months. Should be sound, though." "It's fine. Quiet. Quiet's what we do best here." May's expression shifted slightly, something guarded entering her eyes. "You'll find folks here keep to themselves mostly. Respectful of boundaries. We like it that way." It felt like a warning wrapped in neighborly advice. Margaret filed it away. She spent the afternoon at the general store buying supplies they needed, groceries, cleaning products, a space heater because the house's furnace wheezed like it might give up any day. The store owner, a taciturn man named Bill, accepted her credit card without comment and helped load everything into her car. By the time Margaret picked up Emily, the day had turned grey again, clouds rolling in from the coast. Emily chattered about her new classroom, the nice teacher, a girl named Sophie, who'd shared her crayons. Relief flooded through Margaret. Maybe this would work. Maybe they could build something here. That evening, while Emily did homework at the kitchen table, Margaret explored the house more thoroughly. The basement was unfinished, just concrete and exposed beams. The attic was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. Curiosity pulled her up the creaking steps. The attic was surprisingly spacious, running the length of the house. Boxes lined one wall, previous tenants' forgotten belongings. Dust motes danced in the light from her phone's flashlight. And there, tucked between 2 boxes, she found it, a map. And drawn on yellowed paper, the ink faded but still legible. It showed the town, the surrounding forest, the roads and trails. But what caught Margaret's attention were the markings. symbols she didn't recognize, notations in a cramped old-fashioned script, and a prominent X deep in the forest, with words written beside it in red ink. Stay away. Corvain Place. Cursed ground. Margaret traced the path on the map with her finger. The X was maybe 3 miles from her house, accessible by an old logging road that branched off forest edge. Someone had taken great care to mark it, to warn others. She folded the map carefully and climbed back down, with her mind turning over that single word, Corvain. It sounded French, or maybe just old. And cursed ground. Small towns always had their legends, their supposedly haunted places that local teenagers dared each other to visit. But something about the careful script, the faded red ink, suggested this wasn't teenage dramatics. This was a warning someone had meant seriously. The following days established a rhythm. Margaret walked Emily to school each morning, then spent her hours job hunting online and making their house feel less temporary. She hung curtains, arranged their books on shelves, put Emily's drawings on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like apples, a gift from Mrs. Patterson. The town gradually revealed itself. The bookshop was run by a quiet man named Thomas, who recommended mysteries and never asked personal questions. The pharmacy was owned by Dr. Harrison, who'd been the town's only doctor for 30 years before retiring and couldn't quite let go of caring for people. May's Diner became Margaret's morning ritual, a place where the coffee was strong and the silence comfortable. But the map haunted her thoughts. She tucked it in her nightstand drawer, but found herself taking it out at night after Emily fell asleep, studying the careful markings and that red X, cursed ground. The words should have seemed ridiculous to a rational woman with a degree in literature and 2 decades of teaching critical thinking. Instead, they felt like an invitation. A week into their new life, Margaret stopped at the library. It occupied the 2nd floor of the town hall, a single room lined with shelves and smelling of old paper and furniture polish. Behind the circulation desk sat a woman who had to be at least 80, her white hair pinned in an elaborate twist, her dress a floral print that belonged to another era. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm Mrs. Pemberton. You must be Margaret Hayes. I've been hoping you'd visit." "You have?" "New residents always do eventually. Looking for the town's history, I imagine." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes, sharp and knowing, behind wire-rimmed glasses, seemed to see straight through Margaret's casual facade. "Or perhaps you found something that's raised questions." Margaret hesitated, then pulled the folded map from her purse. "I found this in my attic. I was curious about the markings." Mrs. Pemberton took the map carefully, studying it with an expression that shifted from interest to something darker. "Ah, yes, this would be old Samuel Brennan's work. He was the postmaster here in the 50s and 60s. Quite the amateur cartographer. And the warnings?" "Samuel was also quite superstitious." Mrs. Pemberton set the map down, her fingers tracing the path to the red X. "The Corvain place has a reputation. Has had one for a very long time." "What kind of reputation?" The old woman was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "Come with me." She led Margaret to a back corner where local history books filled 3 shelves. Most were self-published volumes, spiral-bound community projects. Mrs. Pemberton selected one and paged through it until she found what she wanted. Here, Lucien Corvain arrived in 1892, purchased substantial acreage east of town, built a cabin deep in the forest, kept to himself. Described as a gentleman well-educated but strange. Never aged, people said, though that's likely exaggeration. Left town suddenly in 1897, and no one's seen him since. Margaret studied the brief passage. No photograph accompanied it, just a mention and a mystery. "That's it?" "Official history, yes." Mrs. Pemberton closed the book. "Unofficial history is more interesting. People claimed he only appeared at night, that animals avoided his property, that women who visited him came back changed, strange, and sometimes disappeared altogether. The cabin's been empty over a century, but folks still avoid it. Do you believe it?" Mrs. Pemberton's smile was enigmatic. "I believe that some places carry weight. History, tragedy, whatever you want to call it. And I believe that curiosity can be dangerous, especially for those who've already lost so much. The words landed like stones. Margaret hadn't mentioned her circumstances, but clearly Mrs. Pemberton knew. Everyone knew. Small town meant no secrets. I was just curious about the map, Margaret said, taking it back. Of course. Mrs. Pemberton returned to her desk. But if you decide to satisfy that curiosity further, Margaret, do be careful. The forest here is old and deep. People get lost. That night Margaret stood at her back window again, the map spread on the sill before her. The forest loomed in the darkness, and somewhere in its depths, 3 miles along an overgrown trail, stood a cabin that had spawned legends. A place tied to a man named Lucien Corvain, who'd vanished over a century ago, leaving nothing but whispers and warnings written in faded red ink. 2 weeks passed before Margaret's resolve crumbled. Emily had made friends, real friends, and was invited to Sophie's house for a Saturday playdate. Margaret agreed, grateful her daughter was adapting so well, and found herself with an entire afternoon stretching empty before her. She told herself she was going for a walk. Fresh air, exercise, nothing more than that. The map guided her to the old logging road, now barely visible beneath years of encroaching undergrowth. The day was overcast, the kind of grey October afternoon, where the light seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Margaret wore her hiking boots, jeans, and a jacket that had seen better days. She carried nothing but her phone and a water bottle. The forest closed around her within minutes. These weren't the manicured woods of suburban parks, but true wilderness, untouched and vast. The trees rose like cathedral columns, their canopy filtering what little light remained. The air smelled of moss and decay, rich earth and something older. Her footsteps made no sound on the soft ground. She walked for what felt like an hour, following the faint remains of the logging road. Twice she almost turned back, telling herself this was foolish, that she was a mother with responsibilities and no business chasing legends through the woods. But something pulled her forward, a compulsion she couldn't name. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if the forest had been hiding it until she got close enough. One moment there was nothing but trees, and the next, there it stood in a small clearing choked with blackberry brambles and devil's club. Margaret stopped, her breath catching. The cabin was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories of weathered wood gone silver-grey with age. The roof sagged in places, and one of the second-story windows was broken. But the structure stood solid, defying a century of neglect. Vines climbed the walls, and moss covered the north side like a blanket. "Mom, it looks scary." Emily's voice, clear as day, echoed in Margaret's memory, though her daughter was miles away at Sophie's house. The words she'd said when they first arrived, looking at their new home. But this truly was scary. Not the simple fear of a run-down house, but something deeper, more primal. The cabin radiated wrongness, a feeling that prickled along Margaret's spine and raised goosebumps on her arms. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and walk away, but her feet carried her forward, pushing through the brambles until she stood at the base of the porch steps. The wood was solid beneath her boots, surprisingly sound. 6 steps to a wide porch that wrapped around the front. The door was thick oak, weathered but intact, and above it carved into the lintel were symbols, not letters, not anything she recognized, but intricate designs that seemed to shift when she looked at them directly. Margaret reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the door. It was cold, far colder than the October air warranted. Under her palm, she felt something like a heartbeat, slow and steady and deeply wrong. The door wasn't locked. It swung open under the slightest pressure, hinges creaking. Inside was darkness. Margaret stood on the threshold, peering into the gloom. She could make out shapes, furniture covered in dust, but the shadows seemed too thick, too resistant to the grey daylight behind her. It was as if the cabin's interior existed in a different time, a different season, where light hadn't reached in decades. The feeling of being watched intensified. Not from inside the cabin, Margaret realized with a start, but from the forest behind her. She spun around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the path she'd followed here. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. A text from Sophie's mother confirming pickup time. 4 o'clock. Margaret checked her watch. 2:30? She had time, but suddenly she wanted nothing more than to be back in town, in her shabby little house with her daughter, far from this place. She stepped back from the threshold, letting the door swing shut. It closed with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the forest silence. Margaret marked the location in her mind, noting the distinctive lightning-struck fir that stood at the clearing's edge. She could find this place again. Not that she would. Not that she should, but as she walked back through the darkening woods, she knew she was lying to herself. She'd return. The cabin had hooked something deep inside her, and like a fish on a line, she was being reeled slowly in. Margaret didn't tell Emily about the cabin. She didn't tell anyone. The discovery sat inside her like a secret stone, heavy and cold and strangely precious. That night, after tucking Emily into bed, she stood at the kitchen window with a glass of wine she couldn't afford and stared at the dark forest. Sleep came hard and brought strange dreams. She walked through woods that stretched forever, following a path that glowed silver in moonlight. A voice called her name, cultured and gentle, speaking from shadows she couldn't penetrate. When she woke at 3 a.m, her heart was racing and her sheets were tangled. The next day was Sunday. Emily wanted pancakes, so Margaret made them from scratch, grateful for the distraction of measuring and mixing and flipping. They ate together at their small kitchen table, and Emily chatted about Sophie's house, the trampoline in the backyard, the 3 cats that lived there. "Can we get a cat?" Emily asked, syrup on her chin. "Maybe, when we're more settled." Margaret sipped her coffee, tasting nothing. After breakfast, they drove to the coast, an hour through winding mountain roads. The beach was rocky and wild, waves crashing against stone formations worn smooth by centuries of tide. They collected shells and sea glass, and Emily ran ahead, fearless and laughing, her hair whipping in the salt wind. Margaret watched her daughter and felt the familiar ache of inadequacy. Emily deserved better than this, better than a mother who'd lost everything, better than a father who'd walked away. She deserved stability and security and a future that didn't hinge on maxed-out credit cards and prayers that the car wouldn't break down. They returned home as dusk fell, both tired and wind-burned. Emily went to bed early, and Margaret found herself once again at the window, the forest calling to her in a language she'd never learned but somehow understood. 3 days passed before she returned to the cabin. This time she told herself it was about practicality. Winter was coming and they needed firewood. The forest was full of deadfall, branches and logs she could gather. The logging road would take her deep enough to find good wood. And if she happened to pass near the cabin, well, that was just coincidence. She left after dropping Emily at school, this time bringing a small hatchet and rope for binding wood. The October morning was crisp and clear, the first frost silvering the grass. Her breath plumed in the cold air as she walked the familiar path. The forest felt different in morning light, less ominous, more alive. Birds called from the canopy, and she spotted a deer moving through the trees, its coat the color of rust and shadow. The beauty of it steadied her, made the whole thing seem less like obsession and more like reasonable exploration. She gathered wood as she went, selecting dry branches and stacking them beside the path. Good kindling for their fireplace, which worked better than the wheezing furnace. By the time she reached the clearing, she'd made 3 piles to collect on her way back. The cabin stood waiting. In daylight, it looked less threatening and more sad, a relic of another time, slowly surrendering to the forest that would eventually reclaim it. Margaret approached more boldly than before, climbing the porch steps without hesitation. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room on the ground floor, with a staircase leading up to what must be a loft or bedroom. Furniture sat arranged, as if someone had just stepped out and might return any moment. A table with 2 chairs, a wingback armchair near a stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, volumes still standing in neat rows, despite decades of dust. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grey powder, but underneath, Margaret could see quality. The furniture was solid wood, expertly crafted. The books were leather-bound, their spines embossed with gold lettering too faded to read. A writing desk sat beneath the one intact window, and on its surface lay a leather-bound journal. Margaret crossed the room, her footsteps leaving prints in the dust. The journal was closed, a leather strap wrapped around it and tucked into a brass clasp. Her hand hovered over it, and that feeling returned, the sense of being watched, of standing at a threshold she couldn't see. She picked up the journal. The leather was soft, well-maintained despite the years. When she unbuckled the strap and opened to the first page, she found handwriting. Elegant script in faded brown ink, 1847, May 3rd. I begin this account as a record, though I know not who will ever read it, or if anyone should. Margaret turned the page carefully. The paper brittled beneath her fingers. The script continued, each word precisely formed, the work of someone who'd been educated when penmanship mattered. My name is Lucian Corvain. I write this in my 32nd year, though that number means little now. 3 years have passed since the fever took my family. 2 years since I accepted the offer that damned me. 1 year since I understood the full measure of what I had become. The entry continued for several pages, describing a life Margaret could barely imagine. Lucien had been born in 1815 to a French family in New Orleans, the son of a shipping merchant. He'd been educated, wealthy, engaged to be married. Then yellow fever swept through the city in 1847, killing his parents, his sister, his fiancée in the span of 2 terrible weeks. Margaret read standing at the desk, unable to stop, the morning sun slanting through the dusty window. Lucien's grief poured from the pages, raw and ancient. He'd wanted to die with them, had tried to follow them by simply giving up, letting the fever take him too. But something else found him first. The entry dated May 15th, 1847 was brief. She came to me in the fever dream, offered escape from death, from grief, from the prison of human fragility. I accepted. God forgive me, I accepted. Margaret flipped ahead, her hands shaking slightly. The entries became sporadic, spanning months and then years. Lucien described his transformation, the horror and ecstasy of becoming something other than human. He wrote of the hunger, the way blood sang to him, the terrible clarity of enhanced senses. He wrote of killing, those first awful years when he couldn't control the need, but he also wrote of remorse, deep abiding guilt that grew with each decade. By 1870, he'd left New Orleans, unable to bear the city where his human life had ended. He traveled west, searching for isolation, for a place where he could harm no one. An entry from 1892 read simply, I have found a place far from civilization. Oregon Territory, deep forest, miles from the nearest town. I will build here. I will stop. No more death, no more blood taken from the innocent. The journal became a chronicle of solitude. Lucien described his cabin's construction, the seasons passing, the animals he learned to subsist on instead of human prey. Deer, elk, bear. It was enough to sustain him, though it never truly satisfied. He wrote of the townspeople he occasionally encountered, how he kept his distance, appeared only in darkness, became the strange recluse they whispered about. Margaret found the silver locket tucked between pages dated 1895. It slipped out and landed in her palm, the chain pooling around it. She opened the clasp with trembling fingers. Inside was a daguerreotype, the image faded but still visible. A woman young and beautiful, her dark hair swept up in the style of the mid-19th century. Her eyes stared out from the past, serious and lovely. On the opposite side of the locket, a lock of hair, still dark despite the decades, was preserved behind glass. She turned back to the journal, finding the entry that must correspond. June 7th, 1895, Isabel. Her name was Isabel, and she's gone. The fever took her in 1849, 2 years after I became this thing. I carried her portrait through my wandering, though looking at it brings only pain. Today I placed it in a locket, one final gesture toward a love I destroyed by surviving. Margaret closed the journal carefully, the locket still in her hand. The story it told was impossible. Vampires didn't exist outside of fiction and folklore, and yet she stood in this cabin that should have rotted away a century ago, holding a journal that spanned nearly 200 years. Written in a hand that never aged or changed, the sun had climbed higher, and suddenly Margaret remembered the time. She checked her phone. 11:30. She'd been reading for over 2 hours. Emily's school ended at 3, and she still needed to gather her piles of firewood. She slipped the locket into her pocket, unable to leave it behind. The journal she returned to its place on the desk, though she knew she'd be back to read more. There were hundreds of pages left, entries that continued right up to dates she recognized. Recent dates. This year, someone was still writing in this journal. Someone who claimed to be Lucien Corvain. A man who should have been dust for over a century. Margaret left the cabin with her mind spinning, gathered her firewood in a daze, and walked back toward town carrying impossible questions and a silver locket that felt warm against her leg through her pocket. The locket lived in Margaret's pocket for 3 days before she opened it again. She'd touch it constantly, feeling its weight, the smooth silver warming against her palm. At night, she'd set it on her nightstand and find herself staring at it in the darkness, wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. But the locket was real. The cabin was real, and the journal, with its impossible chronicle, waited for her return. Emily noticed her distraction. "Mom, you're doing it again." "Doing what, sweetheart?" Margaret looked up from her coffee, realizing she'd been gazing out the kitchen window at the forest for who knew how long. "That staring thing. Like you're somewhere else." Emily pushed her cereal around her bowl, studying her mother with concern, too old for 8 years. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just thinking about job applications." The lie came easily, too easily. Margaret hated herself for it, but what could she say? "I found a cabin in the woods where a vampire might live, and I can't stop thinking about him." She tried researching online, typing variations of Lucien Corvain and New Orleans 1847 into search engines. Nothing appeared beyond general history of the yellow fever epidemic. She found no birth records, no death records, no mention of the Corvain family. It was as if he'd never existed, or had been erased so completely that history forgot him. On the 4th day, Margaret returned to the library. Mrs. Pemberton looked up from her desk as if she'd been expecting her, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Back so soon, Margaret?" "I had more questions." "About the Corvain place." Margaret approached the desk, keeping her voice low, though they were alone in the building. "You said he arrived in 1892. Do you have any records from that time? Census data, property records, anything?" Mrs. Pemberton removed her glasses, cleaning them slowly with a handkerchief drawn from her sleeve. "I might. May I ask what's prompted this particular curiosity?" "I went there, to the cabin. No point in lying to someone who clearly saw through her anyway. It's still standing. Better than it should be after all these years. Did you go inside?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "And what did you find?" "Furniture, books, a journal." She didn't mention taking the locket. That felt too private, too much like theft, though who she was stealing from she couldn't say. Mrs. Pemberton replaced her glasses and studied Margaret with those sharp eyes. "Come with me." She led Margaret to a back room, smaller than the main library, lined with filing cabinets and boxes. "Local records," Mrs. Pemberton explained. "Birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds. Everything the county didn't want or couldn't digitize. I've been the unofficial keeper for 40 years. She opened a cabinet and pulled out a leather folder, the kind lawyers used a century ago. Inside were documents, yellowed and fragile. Lucien Corvain purchased 160 acres in 1892 from the logging company. Paid in gold coin, which was unusual but not unheard of. No record of where he came from, no employment listed, no family. Just appeared with enough money to buy land outright. Margaret examined the deed. The signature was elegant, the same hand she recognized from the journal. "What else?"
Not much.
He kept to himself. The town gossip from that era, what's recorded in old newspapers, mentions him only in passing. The hermit in the woods, the strange gentleman who only came to town after dark. There were rumors, of course. Small towns breed rumors like rabbits breed. What kind of rumors? Mrs. Pemberton pulled out another document, this one a newspaper clipping, preserved in plastic. The headline read, "Local woman missing, foul play suspected." The date was October 1896. Sarah Mitchell, age 23, disappeared after telling friends she planned to visit the Corvain cabin. Her body was never found. A month later, another woman, Catherine Reed, vanished under similar circumstances. Both had been seen heading toward Corvain's property. Margaret's stomach tightened. And Lucien? Left town shortly after. 1897, same as the history book said. Just disappeared. The cabin's been empty ever since, or so everyone assumed. Margaret stared at the newspaper clipping, at the grainy photograph of Sarah Mitchell, a young woman with hope in her eyes who'd walked into the forest and never returned. You think he killed them? I think 2 women disappeared after visiting his property, and he left immediately afterward. Draw your own conclusions. Mrs. Pemberton returned the documents to their folder. But I also think that was over a century ago, and whatever happened then is long past mattering, unless he's still there. The words hung in the air between them. Mrs. Pemberton's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. Is he? The old woman asked quietly. Margaret thought of the journal, the entries that continued into this year, this month, the handwriting that never changed, never aged. I don't know, maybe. The journal I found, it has recent entries. Very recent. Then you have a choice to make, Margaret. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was gentle but firm. You can walk away. Forget the cabin. Forget Lucien Corvain. Forget whatever mystery you've stumbled into. You have a daughter who needs you present, not distracted by ghosts. Or you can pursue this, but understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge changes you in ways you can't predict. She paused, her weathered hand resting on the folder. You're already changed, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes. You're not the same woman who walked into my library 2 weeks ago. Margaret wanted to deny it, but couldn't. The cabin had gotten under her skin, into her blood. She thought about it constantly, dreamed about it, felt pulled toward it like iron to a magnet. And beneath the fear and curiosity ran something else. Something she was afraid to examine too closely. Loneliness, a desperate, aching loneliness that had been her companion since Richard left, since she'd lost everything and found herself adrift. The cabin felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. I need to go back, Margaret said. Mrs. Pemberton nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected. Then go carefully. And Margaret, whatever you find there, remember that you have a choice. You always have a choice. That evening, after Emily was asleep, Margaret took out the locket and opened it. Isabel stared back at her from across the decades, beautiful and dead. Margaret studied her own reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing the resemblance Mrs. Pemberton had hinted at. The same dark hair, though Margaret's was streaked with grey. The same oval face. The same eyes, large and dark. She'd always thought her features were ordinary, the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd. But seeing Isabel's portrait, she recognized something she'd never noticed before. A certain quality in the bone structure, the set of the eyes. They could have been sisters or cousins, separated by time and circumstance. Was that why the cabin called to her? Some genetic echo across generations? Or was it simpler than that? Just coincidence and her own desperate need to feel special, chosen, noticed by something that saw her as more than a failed wife and struggling mother. Margaret closed the locket and slipped it around her neck, tucking it beneath her shirt where Emily wouldn't see. The silver was cool against her skin, a secret she carried like a talisman. The next morning, she drove Emily to school and continued past town, following the road that led to the logging trail. She'd stopped pretending this was about firewood or fresh air. This was about Lucien, about the journal, about understanding what lived in that cabin and why it had claimed so much space in her thoughts. The walk felt shorter this time, as if the forest was accommodating her, pulling her forward. The cabin appeared like an old friend, familiar now, less threatening. Margaret climbed the porch steps without hesitation and pushed open the door. Inside, everything was as she'd left it. The dust, the furniture, the journal on the desk. She crossed to it immediately, opening to where she'd stopped reading. The entries from the late 1890s were dark. Luthien wrote of his failure, his inability to resist the hunger when loneliness became too great. Sarah Mitchell and Catherine Reed, he named them both, confessed to their deaths in stark, terrible detail. But he also wrote of his horror afterward, his decision to leave rather than kill again. "I cannot stay," he'd written in November 1896. "The hunger grows stronger when I allow myself human connection, even the brief encounters of commerce and conversation." Sarah came to me seeking shelter from a storm. I should have turned her away. Instead, I welcomed her inside, made tea, listened to her speak of her life in town. When darkness fell and the storm worsened, she asked to stay until morning. I agreed, believing I had the strength to resist. I was wrong. The entries that followed were sparse, separated by months. Luthien traveled, never staying anywhere long. California, Washington, Alaska. Always moving, always alone, learning to survive on animal blood and isolation. An entry from 1923 caught Margaret's attention. "I have been what I am for 76 years. 3/4 of a century spent as a monster learning to be less monstrous. Today I realized I can no longer remember Isabel's face without the portrait. The memory has faded, worn smooth by decades, until nothing remains but the shape of grief itself. I do not know if this is blessing or curse." Margaret read through the 20th century in Lucien's precise script. He witnessed wars from a distance, watched humanity destroy itself and rebuild over and over. He wrote of the isolation, how it calcified around him like stone. Until some years he went months without speaking aloud, his voice strange to his own ears. The entries from the 1990s showed a different kind of pain. The world has changed beyond recognition. The forest shrinks each year as the town expands. Soon they will find me, these modern humans with their technology and progress. I should leave again, but I am tired. So terribly tired of wandering, but he hadn't left. The entries continued right through to the present. Margaret flipped to the most recent page and froze. The entry was dated 5 days ago. October 28th, 2025. She has been here 3 times now. The woman with Isabel's face. I watch from the shadows when she comes, see her touching my things, reading my confessions. I should be angry at this invasion, this trespass. Instead, I feel only curiosity. Who is she? Why does she return? And why, after so many years of careful isolation, do I find myself hoping she will come again? Margaret's hands shook, he knew. He'd been watching her, invisible in the shadows, while she stood in his cabin reading his most private thoughts. The violation should have terrified her, sent her running back to town. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Recognition. She set the journal down and spoke into the quiet room. "I know you're here. I can feel you watching," silence answered. Margaret waited, her heart hammering, but nothing moved in the shadows. If he was there, he chose not to reveal himself. She pulled the locket from beneath her shirt, holding it up. "I took this. I'm sorry. I'll leave it if you want, but I needed something real, something to prove I wasn't imagining all of this. Still nothing." The cabin held its breath. Margaret's eyes stung with tears she didn't fully understand. "My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 52 years old, and my life fell apart 6 months ago. I lost my husband, my home, my job, everything I thought defined me. I came here with my daughter because it was the only place we could afford, and I found your cabin by accident. Or maybe not accident. I don't know anymore." She wiped her eyes roughly. "I read what you wrote about Sarah and Catherine. I should be terrified. I should run and never come back. But I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of going back to my empty life, to being invisible, to mattering to no one." Her voice broke. "I'm so tired of being alone." The confession hung in the air. Margaret felt foolish, talking to shadows. pouring out her heart to a creature who might not even be there. But it had needed saying. These truths she'd carried since the divorce. Since she'd looked in the mirror one morning and realized she'd become a ghost in her own life. She left the cabin as the sun began its descent, the locket still around her neck. Behind her in the growing darkness, something watched her go with ancient eyes that had witnessed a century and a half of suffering and knew the shape of loneliness when they saw it. That night, Margaret dreamed of the cabin. In the dream, she walked through rooms that stretched beyond the physical structure, hallways lined with portraits of people long dead. At the end of a corridor stood a figure, tall and still, watching her approach. She woke at dawn, the locket warm against her chest as if it had absorbed her body heat through the night. Emily was still sleeping, and Margaret made coffee in the grey pre-morning light, thinking about what she'd said in the cabin. The raw honesty of it embarrassed her in retrospect, but also felt liberating. She'd spoken truths she'd barely admitted to herself. The days developed a pattern. Margaret took Emily to school, returned to the cabin, and read more of the journal. Sometimes she spoke aloud, telling Lucienne about her life, her daughter, the small details of her days. She never saw him, never heard a response, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Not threatening, but attentive, as if someone was listening carefully to every word. She began bringing things with her. A thermos of coffee, a sandwich she'd eat sitting at his desk. Once she brought a book from the town library and read aloud for an hour, just to fill the silence with something other than her own voice. Emily noticed the changes in her mother. Margaret smiled more, seemed less haunted by the weight of their circumstances. When Emily asked what made her happy, Margaret said she'd been taking long walks in the forest, that the fresh air was helping. It wasn't entirely a lie. A week after her confession in the cabin, Margaret found a new entry in the journal. She'd learned to check each time she arrived, and there it was, dated the previous evening. Margaret Hayes. The name suits her. She comes almost daily now, speaks to me as if I am her confidant. I should discourage this, should find a way to frighten her away. She has a daughter, responsibilities, a life that could still be rebuilt. Attachment to me offers nothing but pain. Yet I find myself waiting for her footsteps on the porch, for her voice filling these silent rooms. Is it possible to be selfish after so many years of self-denial? I fear I'm about to find out. Margaret traced the words with her finger, her pulse quickening. He was listening. Not just aware, but engaged, thinking about her when she wasn't there. The knowledge thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. She pulled out a pen from her bag, hesitated, then wrote beneath his entry. I come because I choose to, not because I'm foolish or naive, but because for the first time in months I feel like myself again. Like I matter. You don't have to protect me from my own decisions, Lucienne. I'm stronger than I look. She left the journal open to that page, the ink still wet. The next day there was a response. Strength is not the question. I've seen strong people broken by what I am. You wear Isabel's face, speak with intelligence and sadness that calls to something in me I thought long dead. This is dangerous ground, Margaret. For both of us, their written conversation continued over days. Margaret would write in the morning, and by her return the next day, Lucienne had responded. They discussed books, philosophy, the nature of loneliness. He wrote of his human life with a clarity that made it vivid. She wrote of her marriage's slow death, the small betrayals that preceded the final one. Did you love him? Lucienne asked in one entry. I thought I did, Margaret wrote back. But maybe I loved the idea of being loved more than I loved him. When he left, I realized I'd been disappearing for years, erasing myself to fit what he wanted. I don't know who I am without that role. Wife, mother, teacher. Take those away and what's left? His response came the next day. Everything that matters. The roles we play are not who we are, only what we do. You are Margaret. That is enough. She sat at his desk, reading those words over and over, feeling something crack open in her chest. When had anyone last seen her as simply herself? Not as someone's wife, or mother, or employee, but as a complete person worthy of attention. She wrote one more line before leaving. I want to see you. Not shadows or silence, you. The next morning there was a single word in response. Tonight. Margaret told Emily she was meeting a friend for dinner. Another lie to add to the growing collection. Emily accepted it without question, happy to spend the evening with Sophie and her family, who'd become their closest connection in Hollow's End. Margaret dressed carefully, a ridiculous gesture for meeting a vampire in an abandoned cabin, but she couldn't help herself. Dark jeans, a sweater the color of wine, her good boots. She brushed her hair until it shone, applied lipstick for the first time in months, then wiped it off feeling foolish. This wasn't a date. This was meeting a creature who'd killed people, who'd lived through centuries, while everyone he'd known turned to dust. But her hands still shook as she drove toward the forest road. Twilight was falling. The sky, that particular shade of purple-grey that exists only in autumn. Margaret parked where she always did and walked the path she'd memorized. The forest was quiet, not even birds singing, as if nature itself held its breath. The cabin's windows glowed with soft light. Candles, Margaret realized as she approached. He'd lit candles for her arrival. She climbed the porch steps, her heart hammering so hard she felt it in her throat. The door stood open, an invitation. Margaret stepped inside. The cabin had been transformed. The dust was gone, the furniture polished until it gleamed. Candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows. The fireplace held a small blaze, warmth radiating into the room. And standing beside the mantel, completely still, was a man. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of slender build that suggested strength without bulk. His hair was dark, worn longer than modern fashion, curling slightly at his collar. His face was beautiful in a way that transcended simple handsomeness. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that looked carved from marble. But it was his eyes that held her, pale grey like winter ice, ancient and infinitely sad. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt, but they fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of another era when tailoring mattered. He looked exactly as she'd imagined from his writing. Cultured, refined, and utterly inhuman. They stared at each other across the room. Neither spoke. Margaret couldn't have if she tried, her voice locked somewhere behind her racing heart. Finally, Lucien moved. Just a small gesture, his hand indicating one of the chairs by the fire. "Please, sit. You've walked far." His voice matched his appearance perfectly. Cultured, with the faintest trace of an accent that might have been French or might have been the way people spoke 2 centuries ago. It was a voice made for poetry and midnight confessions. Margaret crossed to the chair, grateful because her legs felt uncertain. Up close she could see details the candlelight hadn't revealed. His skin was pale, too pale, with a quality like fine porcelain. No color beneath it, no warmth of blood. His hands, she noticed when he gestured, were the hands from old paintings. Long-fingered, elegant, utterly still in a way living hands never were. "You're real," she said. The first words she could manage. "As real as something like me can be." He took the chair opposite, moving with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic. "Though I've questioned my own reality often enough over the years. How old are you?" "I was born in 1815, transformed in 1847. You can do the mathematics." A slight smile touched his lips, there and gone like candlelight flickering. 210 years of existence, 178 of them as this. Margaret studied him, this impossible being who wrote philosophy in journals and lived alone in the woods. "You don't look like a monster. Monsters rarely do. That's what makes them dangerous." His pale eyes held hers. "You should be terrified, Margaret. You should run from this place and never return. Instead, you wear Isabel's locket and come to me at night, alone, trusting that I won't do what my nature demands." "Will you?" "No." The word was absolute, carrying 2 centuries of hard-won control. "I made a choice after Catherine died. Never again would I take human life. I've kept that vow for 129 years. I will not break it now. Tell me about Isabel," Margaret said. She needed to understand this connection, why she wore the face of a woman who'd been dead for over a century. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. She was the daughter of a merchant, We were to marry in the fall of 1849. The fever took her in August, 2 years after I'd become what I am. I'd stayed away from her after my transformation, knowing the danger I posed. But she found me anyway, demanded to know why I'd abandoned her. Did you tell her? No, I couldn't bear to see fear replace the love in her eyes. So I invented excuses, made myself cruel to push her away. She died thinking I no longer cared for her, never knowing I was trying to protect her from myself. His voice carried an ocean of regret. I have carried that failure for 176 years. Margaret touched the locket at her throat, and I looked like her, extraordinarily so. When I first saw you approaching the cabin, I thought I was hallucinating. Centuries of isolation finally breaking my mind. But you were real, and you kept returning, and I began to wonder if the universe had a sense of irony I'd never credited. You don't believe in fate. I stopped believing in most things long ago. God, destiny, justice. They all seemed inadequate explanations for what I became and what I've done. He leaned forward slightly, candlelight playing across his features. But you've made me question that certainty. Perhaps there are patterns we cannot see, threads connecting past to present in ways beyond comprehension. Margaret felt the weight of his attention, the intensity of those pale eyes. She should be uncomfortable, but instead she felt seen in a way she hadn't been in years. Tell me about your life. The journal entries are scattered. I want to understand the full story, so he told her. Not the abbreviated version written in his journal, but the living narrative of 2 centuries. He described his human childhood in New Orleans, the bustling port city where French and Spanish cultures merged. His education in Paris, the grand tour of Europe that young men of means undertook. His return home to take over his father's shipping business, his engagement to Isabel, the future that had seemed so bright and certain. Then the fever. The horror of watching everyone he loved die while he remained helpless. The desperation that made him vulnerable when the vampire found him. Her name was Marguerite, Lucien said. Ancient even then, though she appeared no older than 30. She offered me immortality, power, freedom from death. I accepted without understanding the cost. The hunger, the isolation, the watching of centuries pass while you remain frozen. She abandoned me within weeks, bored with her new creation. I learned control through trial and error, and the errors were often fatal to others. He spoke of the decades of violence, of being a monster in truth. Then the slow awakening of conscience, the growing horror at what he'd become. His journey west, seeking isolation where he could harm no one. The cabin built with his own hands, a sanctuary and prison combined. I've fed on animals exclusively for over a century, he said. Deer, elk, bear. It sustains but never satisfies. The hunger is always there, a constant companion. But it's manageable, tolerable, especially when the alternative is becoming what I was in those early years. Margaret listened, absorbing the impossible history. You've been alone all this time. No one else like you? I've encountered others over the years. Most are solitary by nature or necessity. We're not the social creatures that folklore suggests. Creating others is possible but complicated and carries risks. The vampire who made me gave me her blood and spoke words in a language I didn't recognize. Whether that's universally necessary, I cannot say. Have you ever made another vampire? No, I would never inflict this existence on anyone. His expression hardened. Marguerite gave me no choice, made me without consent. I consider that the gravest of her crimes against me. Whatever else I've done, I've never stolen someone's humanity from them. The fire crackled, and Margaret realized hours had passed. The candles had burned low, casting longer shadows. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and through the window she could see stars scattered across the clear night sky. I should go, Margaret said, though she didn't move. Emily will be home soon, your daughter. You've spoken of her in your journal entries. Lucien's expression softened. She's fortunate to have a mother who loves her so completely. I don't know about that. I've been so distracted lately, so caught up in this. Margaret gestured between them, encompassing the cabin, their strange connection. She deserves better than a mother who sneaks off to visit vampires in the forest. She deserves a mother who is alive in her own life, not merely going through motions. From what you've written, she seems happier since you came here. Children sense authenticity, even when they don't understand its source. Margaret considered this. It was true that Emily had bloomed in Hollow's End, made friends, seemed more secure despite their reduced circumstances. Perhaps children needed less material comfort and more emotional presence than adults assumed. "Will you come again?" Lucien asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question, this ancient creature asking permission from a mortal woman. "Do you want me to?" "More than I should, more than is wise." He stood, and Margaret did the same, suddenly aware of how close they were. "You've awakened something I thought permanently dormant. Hope, perhaps, or simply the memory of what it felt like to connect with another being. Either way, it's dangerous. Hope leads to attachment to pain. I've learned this lesson repeatedly. Maybe some lessons need unlearning." Margaret surprised herself with her boldness. "You've spent over a century punishing yourself, Lucien. At some point, penance becomes just another form of death." His pale eyes studied her face. "You sound like Isabel. She always believed in redemption, in second chances. I found it infuriating and endearing in equal measure. I'm not Isabel. No, you're Margaret, and perhaps that's better. Isabel knew me as I was, human and flawed but alive. You know me as I am now, and haven't fled in horror. That's either courage or foolishness. Maybe both." She picked up her jacket, reluctant to leave, but knowing she must. "I'll come back. If that's all right, it's more than all right. It's what I'll spend the days until then anticipating." He walked her to the door, moving with that unsettling grace. "Be careful on the path. The forest at night holds genuine dangers, regardless of my presence." Margaret stepped onto the porch, the cold air shocking after the cabin's warmth. She turned back to find him standing in the doorway, candlelight behind him, creating a halo effect that made him look both angelic and demonic. "Lucien, thank you for trusting me enough to show yourself. Thank you for giving me reason to." He paused. "Margaret, one more thing. The locket. It was meant to be worn. Isabel would have wanted that, I think. Someone living to carry her memory, rather than having it locked away, gathering dust." Margaret touched the silver at her throat and nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her chest. Then she walked into the darkness, feeling his gaze on her back, until the trees swallowed her completely. The drive home passed in a blur. Margaret's mind replayed every moment, every word spoken, the way his eyes had held hers with such intensity. She felt drunk on it, intoxicated by connection after months of isolation. Emily was already home when Margaret arrived, dropped off by Sophie's parents. She was in her pajamas, reading in bed, and looked up with a smile when Margaret checked on her. "How was your dinner, Mom?" "It was good, sweetheart." "Really good." Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "I love you. You know that, right?" "I know." "Love you too." Emily yawned, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "You seem happy. Happier than before." "I am happy. We're going to be okay here, Em. Better than okay." After tucking Emily in, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, looking toward the forest. Somewhere in that darkness, Lucien stood in his cabin, perhaps looking back toward town, toward her. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. She'd crossed a threshold tonight, stepped into a story that defied reason and logic. And despite every warning, every rational objection, she wanted nothing more than to keep walking deeper into it. The visits became regular, a secret rhythm woven into Margaret's days. 3, sometimes 4 times a week, she'd return to the cabin after dropping Emily at school. Lucien was always there, waiting in the way only the immortal could wait, patient and still. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they'd both read, though his list spanned 2 centuries and included first editions of works she'd only studied in college. Philosophy, art, music. He'd known composers whose names filled history books, had watched art movements rise and fall, had witnessed revolutions and wars from the perspective of someone outside human time, but they also talked about smaller things. Margaret's teaching career, the students she'd loved and the ones who'd challenged her. Her marriage, the slow erosion of intimacy that she'd ignored until it was too late. Emily's personality, how she was both like and unlike Margaret at that age. Lucian listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never dismissing. It was intoxicating to be heard so completely, to have someone interested in the details of her life, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. In turn, he shared more of his existence. The way time felt different when you had infinite amounts of it. How centuries could pass in what felt like moments. The loneliness that accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until it became the foundation of your being. The way he'd taught himself to paint during the decades in Alaska. Spending long winters capturing the northern lights in oils he mixed himself. "I burned them all eventually," he said one afternoon as they sat by the fire. November had arrived, bringing rain that drummed against the cabin's roof. Hundreds of paintings, decades of work. It felt like vanity, preserving evidence of my existence. Or perhaps I simply couldn't bear looking at them anymore. All that beauty I'd witnessed alone. "That's heartbreaking," Margaret said softly. "That's immortality. Everything you create outlasts its purpose. Everything you love turns to dust." He looked at her, something complicated in his expression. "Present company excluded, though you understand that makes this more dangerous, not less." Margaret knew what he meant. She was mortal, aging, even as he remained frozen. Already her hair showed more grey than when they'd met, tiny lines deepening around her eyes. In 10 years, 20, the difference would be stark. And then she'd be gone, another name in his long catalogue of losses. "We could not think about that," she suggested. "Not dwell on inevitable endings. Just be here now while we can, living in the present." Easier said than done for someone who remembers every present moment of 2 centuries. But he smiled. And Margaret realized how rare his smiles were, how precious each one felt. Their relationship shifted in subtle ways. Conversations moved from the intellectual to the personal. Lucien began sharing not just facts, but feelings, the emotional landscape of his existence. Margaret found herself confessing things she'd never told anyone. Fears and hopes she'd kept locked away even from herself. She told him about the night Richard left, how she'd found the note on the kitchen counter and sat there for 3 hours, unable to move, feeling her life crack apart. How she'd had to be strong for Emily, couldn't fall apart because her daughter needed her intact, functional. How she'd pushed the grief down deep and kept pushing until she wasn't sure what was real anymore. "You're real," Lucien said, his voice fierce. "More real than anyone I've encountered in decades. Your pain, your strength, your determination to build a life from ruins. That's not weakness, Margaret. That's extraordinary resilience." No one had called her extraordinary before. Competent, perhaps, reliable, but not extraordinary. The word settled in her chest like a warm stone. One evening in mid-November, as frost formed patterns on the windows, Lucien asked the question she'd been expecting. "What do you want from this, from me? We've danced around it for weeks, but I need to understand what you're seeking." Margaret considered carefully. "I don't know. Connection, I suppose. To matter to someone. To feel alive again instead of just surviving." She met his gaze. "What do you want?" "The same. And that terrifies me, because nothing good can come from a vampire wanting anything from a human. History has proven that repeatedly." He stood, pacing to the window, his reflection invisible in the dark glass. "I should end this. Send you away for your own protection. But I find I lack the strength. You've become necessary to me, Margaret, and necessity is a dangerous thing." The revelation came on a cold December evening when the first snow began to fall. Margaret had arranged for Emily to stay overnight at Sophie's house, a sleepover that gave her the freedom to visit Lucien without watching the clock. She arrived at dusk with a thermos of soup she'd made. A ridiculous gesture, but one that felt right. This offering of warmth to a creature who existed in permanent cold. Lucien greeted her at the door with something she'd never seen before. Hesitation. He held an old wooden box, the kind used for storing documents, and his expression carried a weight she couldn't read. "Come in," he said. There's something I need to show you. Something that will change everything. Margaret's stomach tightened, but she followed him inside. The fire burned bright, and candles illuminated the room. He'd arranged 2 chairs close together, the box resting on a small table between them. "I've debated showing you this for weeks," Lucien said as they sat. "Part of me believes you have a right to know. Another part fears what the knowledge will do, how it will alter your perception of our connection." He placed his hand on the box, but didn't open it. "Before I show you, I need you to understand something. I did not seek this. I did not engineer our meeting or manipulate events to bring you here. When you stumbled upon my cabin, it was genuinely by accident." "I believe you," Margaret said, though unease crawled up her spine. "Lucien, what's in the box?" He opened it slowly, removing items wrapped in cloth. The first was a daguerreotype, larger than the one in the locket. He handed it to Margaret, and she found herself staring at Isabel again, but in a fuller portrait. The woman stood beside a young man, clearly Lucien in his human life, both dressed in the fashion of the 1840s. They looked happy, poised on the edge of their future together. "I've shown you this before, in the locket," Lucien said quietly. "But there are others." He handed her a second photograph, this one more recent, perhaps from the 1920s, based on the quality and style. A woman stood on a street corner, caught in profile. Margaret's breath caught. The woman looked exactly like her. Same dark hair, same facial structure, same eyes. Her name was Catherine Brennan, Lucien said. "I encountered her in Seattle in 1927. She was a teacher, recently widowed, struggling to support her young son. The resemblance to Isabel was striking, though not as complete as yours. I watched her from a distance for months, unable to stay away. Eventually I introduced myself. We became friends. She never knew what I was." Margaret stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. "What happened to her?" "She died of pneumonia in 1929. Natural causes, nothing to do with me. I attended her funeral from a distance, another ghost mourning a ghost." He pulled out more photographs, spreading them on the table. Women from different eras, all bearing various degrees of resemblance to Isabel. "To Margaret, Pijesidvi Anna Kowalski. Librarian in Portland. Killed in a car accident before I could decide whether to approach her, 1978. Elizabeth Chen, artist in San Francisco. She married and moved to Australia. I never spoke to her, 1995. Sarah Mitchell. Yes, the same name as the woman I killed in 1896, though no relation. She was a doctor, and when I learned her profession, I took it as a sign to stay away. She would have asked questions I couldn't answer. Margaret counted 7 photographs total, spanning over a century. 7 women who looked like her, like Isabel, scattered through time and space. I don't understand. How is this possible? Bloodlines, Lucien said. Isabel had a sister who survived the fever. She married, had children. Those children had children. The genetic markers that created Isabel's features have been passed down through generations, occasionally expressing strongly enough that I recognize them. You're not a reincarnation, Margaret. You're a descendant. Isabel's blood runs in your veins, diluted by time but unmistakable. Margaret couldn't speak. The photograph swam before her eyes. All these women who'd carried Isabel's face through time. Women who'd lived and died while Lucien watched from the shadows, waiting for something he couldn't name. I never approached most of them. Lucien continued, his voice low. What could I offer except pain? A connection to a creature they couldn't understand, a relationship with no future. I learned to recognize the signs, the particular combination of features that marked Isabel's line, and I stayed away. Protected them by keeping my distance, but not me. Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears. You didn't stay away from me. You found me first. Came to my door, spoke to me through the journal, made yourself impossible to ignore. His pale eyes held hers. And you're different from the others. Not just in appearance, but in circumstance. You needed something I could offer. Understanding, connection, a place where you could be yourself without judgment. Or perhaps I'm simply making excuses for my own selfishness. Margaret stood, needing to move, to process. She walked to the window where snow fell in thick flakes, covering the forest in white silence. Her mind raced through implications and possibilities. She was Isabel's descendant. The woman Lucian had loved over a century ago was her ancestor, her blood. How far back does it go? She asked. The connection? I traced your line after our third meeting. It wasn't difficult once I had your name. Isabel's sister, Marie, married a man named Thomas Hayes in 1851. They moved west during the gold rush, settled in California. Your family tree branches from there, generations of Hayes and their various spouses. Your father was William Hayes, descended directly from Marie's eldest son. You researched my family. Margaret turned to face him. While I was falling for you, you were investigating my bloodline. I needed to understand, to know if this was coincidence or something else. Lucien stood as well, though he kept his distance. Margaret, I've lived long enough to stop believing in pure chance. The universe operates on patterns, connections we can't always see. You coming here, finding my cabin, wearing Isabel's face. It feels like design. Design for what purpose? So you could have another chance with your lost love. The anger surprised her, hot and sharp. I'm not Isabel, Lucian. I'm not a substitute for her or a cosmic gift delivered to ease your loneliness. I'm my own person with my own life. I know that. His voice was fierce. You think I don't see you? Margaret Hayes, 52 years old, divorced mother, former teacher, the strongest person I've encountered in decades. You're not Isabel. You're better, more real, more present, more alive. Isabel was sweet and kind, and entirely unprepared for the darkness in the world. You've walked through fire and come out tempered, not broken. The words hit her like a wave. Margaret felt tears threatening and forced them back. Then why show me this? Why tell me about the others? Because you deserve the truth. All of it. Lucian moved closer but stopped several feet away, giving her space. I won't build a relationship on deception, no matter how much easier that would be. You need to know what you are to me. Isabel's descendant, yes, but also yourself. Both things are true simultaneously. Margaret looked at the photographs again, these ghost women who'd carried her face through history. She thought about bloodlines and destiny, about the strange paths that brought people together. Then she thought about Emily, about the future she was trying to build, about whether any of this was fair to her daughter. I need time, she said finally, to think about what this means, of course. Take all the time you need. Lucien's expression was carefully neutral, but she saw the fear beneath it. Fear that she'd walk away, that this revelation had broken something irreparable. Margaret, whatever you decide, know that these weeks with you have been the first time in over a century that I've felt truly alive. That's not because you look like Isabel. It's because you're you. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Then she gathered her coat and walked to the door. Lucien didn't follow, just stood amid the candlelight and photographs, looking more alone than she'd ever seen him. Outside, snow fell soft and silent. Margaret walked to her car, through accumulating white, her mind spinning with impossible truths. She was connected to Lucien through blood and time, through a woman who'd died before her great-great-grandmother was born. The relationship she'd thought was about choice and connection was actually about genetics and fate. Or was it? Perhaps both could be true. Perhaps she was Isabel's descendant and still herself, making her own choices. Perhaps destiny and free will weren't opposites, but partners in the strange dance of existence. Margaret drove home slowly through the snow, no closer to answers than before. Margaret didn't return to the cabin for a week. The longest stretch since she'd first met Lucien, and every day felt like an open wound. She threw herself into Christmas preparations, decorating the house with Emily, baking cookies, pretending everything was normal while her mind replayed the revelation endlessly. Emily noticed, of course. "Mum, are you okay? You seem sad. Just tired, sweetheart. The holidays always make me a little melancholy." Another lie, and Margaret hated herself for it. But how could she explain? Your mother discovered she's genetically connected to a vampire's lost love from 1847, and now she's questioning whether her feelings are real or just an echo in the blood. She spent the evenings after Emily was asleep, researching her family tree. Lucien had been right. Marie Corvan, Isabel's younger sister, had married Thomas Hayes in 1851. Their son, William, had a daughter named Margaret, the first to carry her name. The line continued unbroken, generation after generation, until it reached her father, William Hayes, who died when Margaret was 25. She'd never known about the Corvan connection. Her family history had been sparse, just names and dates without stories. Now she understood why. Marie must have wanted to forget New Orleans, forget the fever that killed her parents and sister. She'd built a new life in California and buried the past completely, but the past had a way of returning, it seemed. Written in features, in the architecture of bone and blood. On the seventh day, Margaret found herself driving toward the forest without consciously deciding to go. Her hands knew the wheel, her feet the pedals. The car carried her like a current carries a leaf, inevitable and unstoppable. The cabin appeared through winter trees, smoke rising from the chimney. He was there. Of course he was. Where else would he be after 2 centuries? Margaret climbed the porch steps, her heart in her throat. Before she could knock, the door opened. Lucien stood there, and the relief that crossed his face was so profound it nearly broke her. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said quietly. "Neither was I." Margaret stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. "But I couldn't stay away. I tried. I spent a week thinking about bloodlines and destiny and whether any of this is real or just genetics playing tricks. And you know what I realize? Tell me." "It doesn't matter." The words came out fierce, certain. "Maybe I carry Isabel's blood. Maybe that's why I have her face. Why I found your cabin when 1,000 other people have walked past it without seeing. But my feelings aren't genetic memory, Lucien. They're mine. I choose to be here, not because of who my great-great-great-grandmother was, but because of who you are. Who we are together." Lucien stared at her as if she'd performed a miracle. "You're sure?" "No. I'm not sure about anything except that these past weeks have been the first time since my divorce that I've felt like myself. Like I matter. Like there's a future worth building." Margaret moved closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm terrified of what you are, of what this could mean, of how it might end. But I'm more afraid of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what if." Margaret. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a plea. "I can't promise you forever. You're mortal and I'm not. In 20 years, 30, you'll age while I remain unchanged. You'll die and I'll endure. That's the inevitable mathematics of what we are. Then we have 20 or 30 years. Some people don't get that much." She reached up, her hand hovering near his face. "May I?" He nodded and she touched his cheek. His skin was cool, smooth as marble, but beneath it she felt something. Not a heartbeat, but a vibration, life of a different kind. He closed his eyes at her touch, and she saw vulnerability there, this ancient creature undone by something as simple as a caress. "I want this," Margaret said. "Whatever it is, however long we have. I want to choose you, not because fate decided it, but because I decide it." Lucien opened his eyes, those pale grey depths holding centuries of longing. "Then I'm yours, for as long as you'll have me." Their relationship deepened through the winter months. Margaret came to the cabin whenever she could steal time, and those hours became the center around which her life orbited. They talked, always talked, but now there was touch as well. Small gestures at first, her hand in his fingers brushing her hair back from her face. Contact that would have been unremarkable between ordinary lovers, but felt momentous between mortal and immortal. Lucien was infinitely careful with her, always aware of his strength, the danger he posed. But Margaret found she wasn't afraid. His control was absolute, honed by over a century of discipline. When he held her hand, his grip was gentle despite the power that could crush stone. When he pulled her close by the fire, she felt safe in ways she'd never felt with Richard, who'd been human and supposedly harmless. They began making plans, tentative explorations of a shared future. Lucien had resources, money accumulated over centuries and invested wisely. He offered to help with Emily's education to ensure Margaret never worried about bills or security again. She accepted, though it felt strange taking help from someone who'd lived when her great-great-great-grandmother was a child. "I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes," Lucienne said when she protested. "Let me use it for something meaningful. For you, for Emily. It would give me purpose beyond simple existence." In January, Margaret told Emily about Lucienne, though not the whole truth. Just that she'd met someone, a man who lived alone in the forest, an artist and scholar she'd become close to. Emily was curious but accepting, more interested in whether this meant they'd stay in Hollow's End than in the details of her mother's relationship. "I like it here," Emily said. "I don't want to move again. We won't move. This is home now." Margaret meant it. Hollow's End had stopped being a desperate refuge and become something real, a place where she belonged. In February, Lucienne gave her the moonstone pendant. They sat by the fire on a night when ice coated the windows in fractal patterns, and he presented her with a small wooden box. Inside was a pendant, a moonstone set in silver. Filigree so delicate it looked like frozen lace. The stone itself seemed to glow from within, catching the firelight and transforming it into something ethereal. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed. "It's more than decorative." Lucienne lifted the pendant, and the chain caught the light. "This stone has been in my possession since 1847. It was my mother's, given to her by her mother. It carries a protection, one I've maintained through certain practices I won't burden you with explaining. While you wear this, no vampire can compel you, cannot override your will or cloud your mind." Margaret understood what he was offering. "You're ensuring I always have choice, always. Even with me, especially with me. If you wear this, you'll know that anything you feel, anything you choose, is entirely your own. No supernatural influence, no vampiric manipulation. Just Margaret Hayes making her own decisions." She turned so he could fasten it around her neck. The moonstone settled against her collarbone, warm despite its cool appearance. Lucienne's fingers brushed her nape, and she shivered at the contact. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I need to tell you before this goes any further." Margaret turned to face him, seeing the gravity in his expression. "What is it?" "There's a way to make you like me, to transform you." The words fell heavy as stones. "I've never done it, never wanted to inflict this existence on anyone. But with you, I find myself thinking about it, imagining centuries together instead of decades. It's selfish and wrong, and I hate myself for even considering it." Margaret's breath caught. The possibility had occurred to her in quiet moments, late at night when she couldn't sleep. To become what he was, to step out of time's current and exist beside him unchanging. To have forever instead of a mortal lifetime. How does it work? She asked. "Blood exchange during the moment between life and death. My blood in your veins." Ancient words spoken, a ritual I witnessed once when Marguerite made me. "It's agony," they say, though I remember little of my own transformation. The human body dies and is reborn as something else. You'd lose the sun, normal food, much of what makes human life human. But you'd gain time, strength, and freedom from aging and death, and Emily. Margaret's first thought was always her daughter. What would happen to her? She would age, live her life while you remained frozen. You could watch over her from a distance, ensure her safety, but you couldn't be her mother in any conventional sense. Eventually she'd die and you'd continue. Lucien's voice was gentle but honest. "It's one of the cruelest aspects of this existence. Everyone you love dies, everyone except others like us." Margaret touched the moonstone at her throat, grateful for its weight. This decision couldn't be made lightly, couldn't be rushed by passion or fear of mortality. "I need time to think about it, to understand what I'd be giving up and what I'd gain. Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise." He took her hands in his. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you to transform. I'm simply being honest about the possibility. If you choose to remain human, to age and die naturally, I'll treasure every moment we have. Your mortality doesn't make you less precious. If anything, it makes you more so. But it would end, and you'd be alone again. Yes, the word carried the weight of 2 centuries. But I've been alone for so long that even a few years with you would be worth the grief that follows. Some people never experience what we have, this connection, this understanding. I'd rather have it briefly than not at all. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks and didn't wipe them away. You really mean that? Every word. Lucian brushed the tears gently with his thumb, careful as always. Don't cry, love. We have time to decide, and time to explore what this means. Love. He'd called her love, and the word settled into her heart like it had always belonged there. They spent the rest of the evening discussing the practicalities. If Margaret chose transformation, it couldn't be done casually. There would need to be preparations, arrangements for Emily's care and education, a carefully constructed story about Margaret's disappearance or death that wouldn't traumatize her daughter. Lucian had connections, people who knew what he was and could help create the necessary illusions. Mrs. Pemberton, Margaret said suddenly. She knows, doesn't she? About you, Lucian nodded. She's known since the 1960s. Found me injured after a confrontation with a bear, saw me heal in moments. I expected her to flee or expose me. Instead, she kept my secret. Said the town needed its mysteries, and I was more interesting than most. She's been a friend in her way, checking on me occasionally. The only human besides you who's known the truth and not feared it. Margaret filed this away. Another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Pemberton had been steering her toward Lucian from the beginning, offering information without forcing choices. The old woman had understood something Margaret was only now grasping. Sometimes destiny needed a gentle push. As Margaret prepared to leave, Lucian pulled her close, his arms around her in an embrace that felt both protective and desperate. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent. He smelled of old wood and winter air, with an undertone of something else, something that defied description. Not human, but not unpleasant. Just other. Whatever you choose, he murmured against her hair, know that I love you. Not because you carry Isabel's blood, not because you found your way to my door, but because you're Margaret Hayes, brave and broken and beautifully alive. That's who I love. I love you too, she whispered, the first time she'd said the words aloud. They felt right, true, like coming home after a long journey. She drove back to town through freezing darkness, the moonstone warm against her skin. The impossible decision loomed before her. Stay human and have decades, or transform and have centuries. Keep Emily close or watch from the shadows. Live a normal life until death, or step into immortality beside the creature she loved. Margaret didn't know which choice was right. Wasn't sure there was a right choice, only different paths with different costs. But she knew she had time to decide, and the decision would be hers alone. The moonstone ensured that. When she arrived home, Emily was already asleep. Margaret stood in her daughter's doorway, watching her breathe, this precious person who'd given her life meaning, even in its darkest moments. Whatever choice she made, it had to honor Emily, had to protect her, provide for her, ensure she grew up loved and secure, even if that meant her mother became something other than human. Margaret made her decision on a Tuesday in late February, not dramatically, not in some moment of grand revelation, but quietly, sitting at her kitchen table after dropping Emily at school. The morning sun slanted through the windows, warming her face, and she realized she'd been stalling, not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because saying it aloud would make it real. She wanted transformation, wanted centuries with Lucian instead of decades, wanted to step outside time's relentless march and exist in the eternal present he inhabited. The knowing settled into her bones like truth, uncomfortable but undeniable, but wanting and choosing were different things. Wanting was selfish. Choosing required acknowledging every consequence, especially for Emily. Margaret spent the day planning. She'd saved letters for Emily's future, written on sleepless nights over the past month. Letters for every birthday until she turned 30, explaining everything. The cabin, Lucian, the impossible love story, the choice Margaret had made. She'd arranged for Emily's guardianship to transfer to Mrs. Pemberton, who'd agreed with surprising readiness. The old woman had simply nodded and said, "I wondered when you'd ask." Lucien's investments would ensure Emily's education, her security, everything she'd need to build a life. Margaret had arranged it all carefully, ensuring her daughter would be protected even without a mother. Especially without a mother, the hardest part was the letters. How do you explain to your daughter that you chose immortality over watching her grow up? That you loved her so much you were willing to become a monster to ensure her future was secure? That you'd watch from the shadows, invisible guardian instead of present parent? Margaret wrote and rewrote, trying to find words that wouldn't wound. In the end, she settled on simple truth. She loved Emily more than life itself. But she also loved Lucien, loved him in a way that transcended reason or mortality. And for once in her 52 years, she was choosing something for herself. Not as a mother or wife or teacher, but as Margaret Hayes, woman, lover, believer in impossible things. That evening, she took Emily to dinner at May's. They sat in their favorite booth and ordered pancakes. Because Emily insisted breakfast food tasted better at dinner. They talked about school, about Sophie's upcoming birthday party, about whether they should get a cat like they'd discussed months ago. "Maybe in the spring," Margaret said, each word carefully measured. When the weather's better, Emily studied her mother with those two perceptive eyes. "You're different, Mom, happier, I think. Is it because of your friend? The one in the forest?" Margaret's throat tightened, partly, but mostly because of you, sweetheart. Because we survived something hard and came out stronger. We built a life here, the two of us. I'm proud of that. Proud of you. I'm proud of us too. Emily reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand, this gesture of comfort from an 8-year-old who'd grown up too fast. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "Better than okay. I promise you, Em, you're going to have an amazing life. Everything you dream of, everything you want. I'll make sure of it." She meant it absolutely. Even from the shadows, even as something other than human, she'd ensure Emily's happiness. That was the one non-negotiable condition she'd given Lucien. Her transformation could only happen if Emily's future was secured beyond any doubt. After dinner, Margaret tucked Emily into bed, reading her favorite story, even though Emily was probably too old for picture books. They lay together in Emily's small bed, and Margaret memorized everything. The weight of her daughter's head on her shoulder, the smell of her shampoo, the sound of her breathing as she drifted towards sleep. "Love you, Mom," Emily murmured. "Love you more than anything," Margaret whispered back. "More than you'll ever know." She waited until Emily was deeply asleep before slipping out. In her bedroom, Margaret changed into simple clothes, dark jeans and a sweater. She left the letters on her nightstand, secured in a box addressed to Mrs. Pemberton, with instructions not to open it unless Margaret disappeared. Everything was arranged. The story she and Lucien had crafted, the hiking accident in deep woods, the body never recovered. Tragic but believable.